Hi, and welcome back to Freedom Health TV. I'm your host, Caleb Jarosh. I'm a licensed acupuncturist in California, and what I want to be talking to you about today is the case-demic situation or a pandemic situation that we're in. And so this is really, really important because what's happening with public policy is that public policy is being determined specifically on case numbers. And the problem with case numbers is that it's not actually a scientific metric. It's not a valid metric for determining the public health because of so many problems with what defines a case. So we're going to actually be looking at that. We're going to dive into that. And I want to start at the beginning of this called pandemic. And really, the numbers coming out of Italy, those are the first numbers that we really were looking at. And what those numbers said to us and the rest of the world is that the average age of people dying of COVID deaths in Italy were 80 years old. And of those, 2.5, there were 2.5 comorbidities that went along with all those people. And that means comorbidities are chronic diseases that are in place that usually kill people as they get older. And that was very much the case in Italy. And what we're seeing worldwide is that 50% of the COVID deaths are actually coming from nursing homes. And per the CDC,
6% of the total deaths, COVID was solely responsible for them, whereas 94% of the people, the deaths, had other severe chronic diseases that could have contributed to their death.
Had 2.6 comorbidities. And let's just talk a little bit about the comorbidities. That's stuff like diabetes, heart disease, chronic lung problems. And so the majority of these deaths, again, have these comorbidities, which make it very, very difficult to determine what actually ended up killing this person. Was it heart disease, which takes anywhere from 20 years to develop, or diabetes, which takes 20 years to develop, and harms the body's ability, the immune system's ability to keep that person healthy and vibrant. So let's look at actually the cases and what's happening with what's being called a case-demic. And there's some serious problems with it because specifically what's being used is a PCR test to determine if someone's positive or negative. And the first problem with the PCR test is it's actually denoted that it's not supposed to be used for diagnosing infectious disease. It's a test that's meant to be used in research. And that's because this test has to be magnified. It can be magnified any number of times, but depending on how much it's magnified, essentially determines how sensitive the test is. So if you magnify it too many times, all the tests are positive. If you don't magnify it enough times, then the test becomes negative. And when I mean magnification, they take a piece of material and they magnify it many, many times to see if they can find these different particles that determine whether you're positive or negative. So if you look right here at this particular article, the FDA is specifically saying that there's serious problems with the PCR tests. And this could be explain one of the reasons why there's this huge increase in cases. What's also important to know and denote is what actually is a case. Does a case mean it's only people that are hospitalized, people that die, or that people that have symptoms? Would that be considered a positive case? Nope. You'd think the answer would be yes, but it's actually no. The definition of a case is actually quite broad. So a case could be if you have your COVID tracking app on your phone and you get close to someone else who also has been determined to be positive, then you can become a case. You can also become a case if you're completely asymptomatic. You go in, you get tested, and if you look right here at this particular graph, increases in cases, specifically for Florida, does not correlate with increases in death. So what I like to say is that detection does not mean infection. And this is really important because if there's a problem, inflated case numbers, then we're determining a public policy, for instance, locking down, shutting down businesses, restricting your movement, my movement, restricting commerce based on something that's not accurate is disastrous. Because what we do know is that these lockdown measures are causing really serious harm. We really won't know the repercussions of it until next year and the year after that.
But there are some people that are doing very, very well during this COVID pandemic. So as you can see right here, large corporations are making record amounts of return. And you can see that here again.
PCR test, specifically Martin Kaldoff from Harvard Medical School and his project, the Great Barrington Project, he has specifically said that if you increase testing, then the cases are going to also increase as well. And really, the scientific metric that should be looking at rather than cases, and I think this will make sense to you, is hospitalizations, actual deaths, and how many people are being hospitalized or admitted to the ICU because of symptoms. So many people that are being tested are asymptomatic, meaning that they don't actually have symptoms. So testing arbitrarily doesn't really give us any valuable information. It actually harms the situation because it can inflate numbers and it can scare people and create public policy that really isn't for the benefit of everybody. And what's confusing is if we look at the CDC, we look at the WHO, we look at the media, what they're really pushing right now, what they're really focusing on is cases. And that switched because what they were looking at before was actually the infectious mortality rate, the amount of people that were dying.
So let's look at an example of this right here.
Any of this is even necessary. Now, we had an extraordinary reaction to an interview I did last week with Dr. Mike Eaton. He's the former chief scientific advisor with Pfizer, the major pharmaceutical company. And he, along with many others, including Carl Hennigan, the professor of evidence-based medicine at Oxford University, and I really defy anyone to question those credentials, have been questioning whether or not we are, well, horribly overreacting to a virus that, like all viruses, we are going to have to learn to live with. And big question marks over whether or not the policies with many Western governments, including the UK's, have been following over the recent months are actually having any effect at all. Well, let's talk about all of this once again with Dr. Mike Eaton, back, I think, quite literally by popular demand. Good morning to you.
Good morning,
Good morning.
Julia. Nice to be back.
Lovely to talk to you. We've had almost 100,000 views on YouTube of your video. Lots of reaction on Twitter. A lot of people just saying, great to actually hear someone sort of expound this. Now, let's just talk about some really basic stuff here. We saw yesterday 3,991 positive cases for coronavirus. It's up 50% in a week. You can understand why huge numbers of people are incredibly worried that we're seeing that uptick in cases. Should we be worried?
Well, thanks for having me back, Julia. So, of course, I definitely don't want to dismiss the possibility that these numbers are real and that people will get ill and potentially go to hospital or even die. But the evidence to date, I think, suggests that all or a substantial part of these positives could be due to what's called false positive tests. Now, government knows that the PCR test is very sensitive, and all tests have a propensity to throw up a particular false positive rate. What's really frustrating, Julie, and your listeners should know this, the government doesn't know what the false positive rate is, or if it does, it's not declaring it and continuing with the assumption that it's zero, and it's definitely not zero. And Carl Hennigan did a calculation, and he showed that if the false positive rate is as little as 0.1%, then more than half the positive tests are in fact false or fake. And I think the false positive rate is probably much higher, possibly 1%. And if that's true, most or all of the positives are actually false, and they're not infected, infectious, or ill.
And the key thing there is, of course, I mean, again, for those of us who are not medically trained or scientific.
Thanks so much for joining me. I'm your host, Caleb Jarosh, and tuning in to Freedom Health TV. And I'll leave you with this last little quote here from Dr. Eaton.